Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, Final Fantasy VI. On December 18th, 1987, an RPG from a no-name publisher named Square was released in Japan. The story that the game was titled Final Fantasy because it was a desperate last-ditch effort from Square, and series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi is at least partially a myth. But the abysmal situation Square and Sakaguchi languished in is not. The game sold well and a franchise blossomed. For its day, the original Final Fantasy had a fairly developed, if cliché, story, and the succeeding games continued to lead the industry in storytelling. Final Fantasy IV was a major milestone. Here was a complicated, weighty, evocative story in a video game, but that was nothing compared to Final Fantasy VI. Originally released in America as Final Fantasy III because Final Fantasies II, III, and V were not originally released stateside. Yes, the old days of localization were very strange. VI has recently begun to creep out of the shadow of the more iconic FF7. It was too good to stay a secret. FF4 was phenomenal considering when it was released. FF6 is just phenomenal. From the sounding of the first notes of Terra's theme, you know this isn't going to be like the previous games in the series. Right off the bat, you have snow and machines and intrigue, gorgeous visuals and epic music that strike you right in the heart like a bolt of lightning. If I may be so bold, at the time of its release, this was the greatest game ever made. If I may be even bolder, this was the game that elevated gaming to the level of high art. You didn't just play this game, you were enraptured by it. There is so much to study from this masterpiece, from how to construct a mid-game twist, to why Kefka is a phenomenal villain, to the incandescence of the opera sequence, to why character reactions led plot points gravity, to how to convincingly develop a large party of characters. The focus of today's piece is how perfectly it blends fantasy and science fiction. This is the first Final Fantasy heavily influenced by sci-fi, and it is also the darkest game in the series up to this point. Those two events are not unrelated. Science fiction can be one of our most idealistic genres, see Star Trek or The Martian, and fantasy can be one of our most idealistic genres, see Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings. But when they are combined, the resulting media is often dark and torn and pessimistic. To see why, let's examine the genres. Fantasy is the older genre by far. It has been around as long as there have been myths, and there have been myths ever since human beings could wonder about the stars and the sky and why things are like they are. In contrast, science fiction is a newer genre. It has basically only existed as we know it today since the Industrial Revolution. Whereas fantasy is born of myth, sci-fi is born of discovery. Instead of wondering about plants and planets, we find out through science, and those revelations light a fire in our minds. We wonder where these discoveries will lead and what will be the consequences. Both genres involve lands foreign to our own, but the foreign lands of fantasy are mostly untouched. That's why the hero's journey is such a popular format for fantasy storytelling. There's this wide open world that's alien to both you and the protagonist. But the foreign lands of science fiction were made as they are by humanity. Sci-fi protagonists may be exploring the unknown, but their ability to do so was dictated by human achievement. Fantasy lands are created as they are. Science fiction lands were molded into their current shape. Both genres have a focus on identity, but in fantasy, the question, who am I, is distinct, whereas in science fiction, it's typically seen through the frame of, who are we? Fantasy is about building an identity. This is true for works ranging as vastly as do Narnia and Game of Thrones. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have science fiction, which is about loss of identity. New identities can be built, but old ones have to be knocked down first. Great examples of this would be Ex Machina and Ghost in the Shell. What does this have to do with Final Fantasy VI and why sci-fi fantasy hybrids tend to be so dark? Well, what I've set up is a dichotomy. Two genres with opposing but not incongruous perspectives that fill the same role. They both require us to step outside our own worlds to see ourselves and our world in a new light. You have the old guard, fantasy, trying to stand its ground against the invading force of science fiction. This mirrors the development that began in the Renaissance and has burgeoned and developed for the last several centuries, where, with the influx of science and tech, myths and traditions became less important. The traditions faded, but they couldn't exactly go away. They were too deeply rooted for that. Hence you have the conflict. To summarize, the main reason why the convergence of science fiction and fantasy has such dark consequences is that the former is exerting a force on the latter, twisting and corrupting it and causing it to fade. This is certainly true in the case of Final Fantasy VI. 1,000 years before the events of the game, there was the War of the Magi. Humans attempted to seize the magical powers of the Espers, and the world was torn apart. A common theme in these science fantasy works is that humans are on the side of technology because they want control and they can control the technology. They then use that technology to try to control the magic as well. The Espers left to create a new world where they could live in peace, but the Magi, these humans who possess the magical powers of the Espers, are killed and blamed for the war. They had the power that the rest of humanity sought, and the rest of humanity couldn't stand that. There was not great technological progress in those days, but such is not the case by the events of the game. Tech has progressed to a late 19th century steampunkish level. The desire to control magic has not changed, but the capacity to do so has. This game's Cid is an engineer for the Gestalian Empire, and he created Magitech. This allows magic to be extracted from Espers and infused into humans and machines. The first human to ever undergo this process, Kefka Palazzo, the game's eventual villain, was driven mad. Because of the nihilism this experiment drove him to, he destroyed the world. Hence, the world's end can be traced through Kefka to humanity's desire to control magic with technology, to use the achievements of progress to make natural forces bow to them. This is science fiction encroaching on fantasy, sucking its life out like a parasite. In our non-magical world, the man-made invading the natural has resulted in the destruction of forests and marshes. Because the forests and marshes of fantasy worlds are glittering and bioluminescent, we like to imagine they're immune to this fate. But if anything, they're more fragile, more vulnerable. There is no hope for magic in this world, and indeed, by story's end, it has expired, taking with it the remaining Espers, save for the half-Esper Terra. Throughout the game, the world's in flux, in transition, and by the end, that transition is over. In that shift, there is a breaking. What ties together the diverse group of protagonists is that sense of loss, of confusion, that inability to form a cohesive identity. Terra's mother is dead, and being half human and half Esper, there is no place for her. The Empire experimented on her, and without having any control over her behavior, she immolated 50 Empire soldiers. When she is found, she has amnesia. Quite literally, she has no idea who she is. Locke has also lost loved ones, namely his father and his beloved Rachel. Like Terra, amnesia factors into his life. Rachel was crushed by a falling bridge while exploring a cave with him, and though he nursed her back to health, she developed amnesia, and he was blamed and forced to leave town. Cyan's family was killed by Kefka. The Figaro brothers saw their father poisoned to death, and the relationship between them grew distant after Sabin left. After what had transpired, they both wanted a life of freedom, but one of them had to run the kingdom, so they agreed to flip for it. What Sabin did not know is that Edgar rigged the game so his brother would win. The otherwise aloof Celis's closest connection is to Cid, and if he dies in the aftermath of the world ending, she attempts suicide in one of the series' most heartbreaking scenes. But she lives. And after being scattered in the aftermath of the world's end, the party is able to find each other again. They live to come to terms with their situations. We see ourselves through others, so it is no surprise that the team is able to form their new identities only as they grow more intimate. And it is no surprise that Kefka, who has no close relations, breaks into madness. His situation is not so different from that of the protagonists. Like Terra, he was subject to the Empire's control, but he had nothing to hold on to. Beneath his clownish persona is a person broken by the world. When science fiction and fantasy fight, fantasy is doomed to lose, but it cannot be completely extinguished. Fantasy may be based in magic, sure, but compared to sci-fi, it is earthier, based more on personal connections, and tech cannot take the place of those connections. They matter. If you cannot hold on to them, and they're allowed to be usurped by machinery, you might as well believe in nothing. I'm glad FF7 is getting a remake, but once that's done, I hope they remake 6. If you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce more amazing content. Also, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that cool stuff. Adios, comrades!